Hey guys, it's Shaylin, and I'm here today with another episode of Recent Reads. I'm excited for this one in particular because I feel like I have a very eclectic mix of books. Like, this isn't just like a 10 literary fiction novels. This is a weird little group of books. There are a couple literary fiction novels in there, but I feel like I've got like a more fun range of books, kind of an eclectic mix. And overall, it is a really good mix of books. Like, just scrolling through it, there are multiple 5-star reads. I feel like this was just like a really good batch of books. Every once in a while, you just get like a good stretch of books that's like really fantastic. I was getting into the Halloween sort of vibes. So I picked up this horror novella, Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, by LaRocca. Apparently this book is like really big on TikTok. Like, apparently it's like a TikTok book, which I didn't know. It just popped up on Goodreads for me and I was like, oh, that seems really interesting. So this book follows the relationship between Zoe and Agnes, two women who meet on a queer message board, develop a very interesting relationship that becomes more and more horrific. This is super freaky and compelling and like disturbing, which I mean is what I think you would expect from a horror novella. The relationship is very bizarre and the book is told through found footage, through their emails and their messages, and the found footage I think works really well for this story. There's also just a lot of very striking imagery that is really impactful and feels very natural even in the chat format. Like, it's very easy with found footage to have any kind of sense of poeticness, feel like it's trying too hard or like it's not natural for the characters, but it felt very natural and it was still very striking. Like, I was actually kind of amazed at how beautiful and description based some of the writing was, even through like a found footage chat format. We don't know much about the two characters. A few things we do learn about the characters do really pull their weight. We didn't really get a sense for the characters outside of this relationship really at all. So it's a bit hard to get the full impact, I think, of the stakes and the outcome of their relationship. And also just, I mean, again, this is partly limit of the form, but the escalation of their relationship felt a little too fast. I felt like we missed some bits in the middle, like they met and then they were at this extreme point of intensity. And I just felt like a little more build up to really earn the conclusion would have benefited this piece. This is a very effective look into how vulnerable queer people can be in online spaces, especially when they feel like it's the only place that they're safe. I do see reviews of this pop up on my Goodreads every so often, and a lot of people give it like 1 star and are like, this was too disgusting, this was terrible, horrific, and gross. And I'm like, look, this is very clearly a horror book. You knew what you were getting into. If you like horror, you might like this. If that's not your cup of tea, just don't say you weren't warned. So then I read The Pump by Sydney Warner Brooman. Sydney very kindly sent me a review copy of this book. This is an interconnected short story collection that all revolves around a town called The Pump, which has a polluted water supply. I think this is the best example of an interconnected short story collection that I've ever read. Every single story in the book builds on the one before it, and they all contribute to building a world. There are a few characters we see throughout different stories, but for the most part, each story does stand on its own. The recurring character throughout all the stories is the Pump, which is so strange and gothic, and it feels alive and very present. There's a lot of like very witty, clever, funny writing that really makes use of the strangeness of the world. A lot of the characters are very strange, very odd. They do weird things on the page, but they're not weird in like a quirky, trying too hard kind of way where it feels without substance. Rather, they feel like pieces of the world. Everything in this collection felt very congruous. So I would have liked a few more examples of the oddities of the setting rather than just the people in it. Like, one of the main weird things that we get as a recurring element of the setting throughout is the beavers. These like carnivorous beavers. But I just wanted to see how the tainted water supply had affected the natural world in a few other ways beyond just the beavers, because I assume if they're like carnivorous beavers, there's probably other strange things going on. I would especially really recommend this one actually to people who want to read a collection but maybe don't have much experience reading short story collections or normally don't like short story collections, because I feel like it overcomes the normal pitfalls of a collection that make them a bit hard to get into. But this one has an overarching character in the town and an overarching journey across all of the stories that I think would make it really appealing to people who are just getting into short fiction. Plus, a lot of the stories are really short, so there's a sense of an escalating, developing narrative. So then I read some poetry. This Wound is a World by Billy Ray Belcourt. Read Billy Ray Belcourt's memoir, A History of My Brief Body, earlier this year, and it was my first Billy Ray Belcourt. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh, he is a poet. Like, the language was so tasty. You can tell that he's a poet in his prose. The prose is poetry, and so I picked up one of his collections. I think this is his first collection, This Wound is a World, and it was fantastic. I really have no notes. I only have feelings. He really said, I will write poems that will make you feel hurt and held simultaneously. He also has a lot of list poems. There's tons of them throughout. It's a recurring form in this book, and they're genius. So then I read The Border of Paradise by Esme Weijun Wang. I've been meaning to read literally anything by Esme Weijun Wang for like years, and I haven't yet. So glad I finally picked up her novel because it's fantastic. So this is a family saga. One side of the family comes from like kind of old money. That branch of the family owns a piano company, I think. The mother's side of the family, Jia Hui, is a first-generation Taiwanese immigrant. So we followed them and their children and those connected to them. Okay, so when I started reading this book, first of all, I want to say that this type of novel where it's a family saga, where every single chapter follows a different character, these books are really hard sells for me. And the reason is just because I've read so many of them. Like, there's some really, really good books with this narrative structure, but I just read so many of them that they became a really hard sell for me because a lot of the time it's hard to know, like, what's different about this one, right? Like, a lot of the time there's not much of a concept. These books are just like, here's a family, we're gonna follow them intergenerationally. That concept at first was really interesting to me the first few times I read it, but it became a harder and harder sell. I'm really, really glad that I did pick this one up. Because it really was fantastic. I remember the first chapter, I was not into it. The first chapter is the chapter that's talking about David, the father's side of the family, his upbringing, their family's old piano money, and I just didn't really care. Like, I was just not that invested. And then after that first chapter, I literally couldn't put it down. This book is really kind of strange in a very grounded way. Like, it's not weird, like, freaky, kind of weird. It's like very realistic people with really weird relationships. Like, it's weird, but it's also extremely realistic. This book is very, like, willing to kind of look into and extract and say the, like, most unspoken, intimate, maybe even unsightly thoughts of its characters in a way that maybe a lot of books and authors aren't willing to do. I could definitely see how there is a lot of content in this book that could be quite off-putting for some people. The characters feel so realistic, and you understand so deeply where this is all coming from. And so when they do, or they think something that's like kind of messed up, you understand the legacy of the family that's brought them to this place. Each new perspective shifts the entire angle that you're seeing the story from, so that each new perspective kind of layers onto it rather than just progressing it linearly. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge of writing a book like this. So the next two books, I actually picked up both of these books for research for a short story that I was writing. So I was working on a short story about a witch trial in like a Puritan village, which is not something I really have background knowledge on. So the first one was The Manningtree Witches by A.K. Blakemore. This is set in Puritan England in the 17th century, and it's the story of the witch trial of Rebecca West, and it's actually based on a true story. I didn't know this until I got to the end of the book. I loved this. The care shows in every sentence. Kind of like what you get in good poetry. You can see the care, the thought into every word. It is written in a pretty historical sounding voice, but I didn't find it hard to read at all. I found the voice to be very detailed, very rich, but very hypnotic and original. The form is fairly fluid in this book. Like, at the beginning, it feels like almost this like roaming, omniscient presence. And then as the book goes on, it zooms in and gets more intimate on Rebecca's character. I don't really know if I could explain the rules of the form and the narrative shifts. I did like the effect of it, and I enjoyed both the very broad emotion sections and the very intimate sections. I thought Rebecca was a really interesting character. Her psychology was very interesting, which I thought was very important for a character who, for a large part of the book, doesn't have too much agency in her situation, but her character psychology was really fascinating. So then I read another book for witchy research, Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch by Rivka Galchen. So this book is set in early 17th century Germany, and we follow the main character Katerina, who is accused of witchcraft. And the book is told as like her account and accounts of like the witch trials that took place. Unfortunately, this was pretty underwhelming to me. The stakes were quite high, obviously, because we had a character being tried for witchcraft, but even in the high stakes, it never really felt like the stakes were high because the storyline felt pretty predictable. Like, there was never really a point where I felt surprised by, like, the insight that the story was presenting me. Overall, I think the main thing is just that the characters felt pretty flat. Like, I don't really remember that much of any of them, and I didn't really get a strong sense of personality, really, from any of them. This book is also told in kind of a found footage format, which I thought so much more could have been done with that. I think that the book could have been more effective if that was leaned into more and was used more to like really extract more characterization, but this wasn't bad. It was just very underwhelming. You know, like, it's not like I disliked any aspect of it or I thought it was badly written. To me, it was just underwhelming. Then we actually have my first ever manga. A friend of mine and I started a Japanese horror movie club. She's really into like Japanese horror movies. She knows them all. It's like her thing. Our Japanese horror movie club kind of then also turned into just a like translated horror book and movie club. So the first book on the roster was Remina by Junji Ito. First of all, can we talk about how freaking gorgeous this is? Like, it's absolutely beautiful. The art is literally amazing. So visually compelling. So this is weird. So at the beginning of the book, this scientist, Dr. Oguro, discovers a new planet and he names it after his daughter, Remina. Remina doesn't really like want to be in the spotlight. She's very shy, but she gets so much attention from this and ends up being like catapulted into stardom. Then it's discovered that the planet is actually coming towards the Earth and basically is like carnivorous. Like, it's like going to like eat the Earth. Like, there's a scene where the planet licks the Earth. Like, what? It's the story of how everyone reacts, how the rich try to flee, how Remina is treated as basically like the scapegoat for this. Anyways, it's absolutely wild. It's a wild ride. This is one of the most like freaky but imaginative books I've read. Like, there's so many things that happen where I was like, look, Junji Ito, we need to have a conversation about this, because this is the weirdest shit I've ever read, and I just like want to know how you came up with this. You know that old question, like, oh, if you could have dinner with one author, living or dead, who would it be? Like, I think I'd pick Junji Ito, because I have one single question that I want to ask him, and that question is how. This man's mind must be protected. So I was reading this with my friend Soto, who we're doing the book club together. We were actually like reading part of the book at the same time. Like, I had her on speakerphone and I ended up getting like a couple pages ahead of her. And then I would hear her go like, holy shit. And then I'd be like, are you on page like 37? I ended up giving this 4-star just for 2 reasons. The first is because there were just some things that felt a little too rushed. There was a little bit of untapped potential in terms of slowing it down just a little bit more, just to get a little bit more out of some of those moments. Like so much happened so fast, and I just feel like it could have been a little more detailed and not felt a little rushed at points. The whole cult that springs up seemingly overnight, and I really wanted to know like just like a little bit about what went into that, you know. They had like full-on rituals and beliefs and stuff, and I'm like, how did this come to be? The other reason why I just didn't feel like I could give it a full 5-star rating was Remina's character. Seems like a lovely girl. It's just the way that she was treated in the narrative. She's really the only female character, and I don't think she had like a single moment of agency. Really, all she does in this book is cry and get like tortured by a cult. Which, to be fair, if I was getting tortured by a cult, I would also be crying all the time. It's not the fact that she was crying all the time. It's just the fact that, like, that's the only action she ever took, was cry, basically, and cry for the male characters that had died. Most of the book, she is, like, physically being carried or dragged around. So the whole book, I was really waiting for her to maybe just have, like, a single moment of agency, for her to be the one to take the agency, but that never happened. She's portrayed as essentially, like, useless, which was too bad, because she's the only woman in the book. I enjoyed every single page. I just feel like I couldn't give a 5-star rating to a book where the, like, literal only woman in the book is portrayed as, like, extremely useless and does literally nothing but cry. In an otherwise, like, very entertaining, creative, well-done storyline, it was just, like, a bit unfortunate portrayal of this character, I thought. And I don't think that it would have fundamentally changed the story or the effect of the story in any way to have allowed her, like, a single moment of agency. So the next book is probably my favorite book in the video, and it's Winter in Sokcho by Elisa Shua Dusapin. So this book is set in Sokcho, which is a coastal resort town in South Korea that is very, very close to the North Korean border. It's like 40 kilometers from the North Korean border, and it's set over the winter where there are no tourists there. And the protagonist is a woman who works in a guest house in Sokcho. This is one of my favorite books of the year. This is one of my favorite books. It is a really sparse, eerie, like, beautiful exercise in mood. Like, this book is so restrained and delicate. The atmosphere is created with, like, really poignant, distilled, carefully chosen imagery. I was just so captured by it, by its haunting quality. The narrator is very understated but complex. There's a lot of ambiguity to her, almost like a playfulness in the way that she reveals and withholds different aspects of herself. The book is told in very short, fragmented scenes. There's very careful attention to landscape, body, food, space, and just the ways that we fit and do not fit into various places. There's an intensity to this book, but also, like, an almost dartingness in the way that it explores things. The book never really lingers on anything too long. It almost touches the burning thing and then skirts away real quick. Discomfort to it, but also almost like a quietness. This is just one of the most beautifully eerie, haunting, but understated books that I've ever read. The protagonist is fascinating. It's all done so carefully, so quietly, but so viscerally. Brilliantly subverts its own expectations. There are points where you think the story will unfold a certain way. It's almost cathartic that the story doesn't unfold in that way, you know? Like, definitely one of my favorites that I've read this year. Maybe my favorite book that I've read this year. So then I read maybe my most anticipated book of the year, Matrix by Lauren Groff. You guys know I love Lauren Groff. Everything she writes turns to gold. And so when I found out that she was writing a book where the concept was 17-year-old girl in the 12th century is thwarted from court and sent to live in an abbey where she then, like, lifts up her fellow nuns to a life of greatness, I was like, Lauren, you did that just for me, right? I mean, I'm sure she didn't do it just for me, but it really did feel like she just reached out and she was like, I see you. I see what you want. This has Lauren Groff's classic richness to it, you know? Like, every time I pick up one of her works, I'm struck by how rich it is. Every single line is either beautifully sensory or profoundly wise, and yet it doesn't feel like it's trying too hard, and it always feels original. Like, even in such image-dense work and style, her imagery and her language always feels fresh, and it always feels original, and it doesn't feel sentimental or overwrought. So tactile. The rendering of the world and the setting is done through voice so beautifully. It's actually quite an exciting storyline. It spans a very long period of time, and the world that she lives in of this abbey is populated by a very compelling cast of characters who are all brought to life like very quickly. I really do think it's everything that I could have asked for in Lauren Groff's newest book. Alright, so to finish this up, I read 2 books by Dionne Brand. I'm just gonna include them both in this video because otherwise I'd have to split them up, and that seems weird. Also, I borrowed these from my roommate and I would like to return them. So the first book I read of hers was The Blue Clerk. This is, I mean, it is poetry, but it's not exclusively poetry. This book is kind of this intermingling of the poems, the poetic creation, and the commentary on the poetic creation from the poet and the clerk. So this book actually kind of has a frame, like we know where it's happening. The clerk is on a wharf and they're reading through the manuscript. I think this is very much a book for writers, like, because so much of it is about act of writing, creating, and reflecting on your own work and discussing what it means to write, what it means to be a poet. So I think those who will get the most out of this would be poets themselves. It's meditation, essay, it's poetry, it's flash fiction. Goodreads describes them as essay poems. I think this book very elegantly disregards form. I would say this was extremely complex, and every single little verso is just like a little pocket of brilliance, you know? There are many different weaving relationships of different ideas throughout the book, and you're kind of rewarded as you keep reading. Like, the work is constantly examining itself and its own voice and its own purpose, and that makes it very complex. I truly had no idea what to rate this. I actually didn't rate it on Goodreads. I just marked it as read. It's just not comparable to any other work, I don't think. I was going to give it a 4 out of 5 because I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was a brilliant work, but I can't say I necessarily feel that I understood everything. That is to my own fault, right? And I don't know, this is a book of such conceptual, linguistic, and formative brilliance. So after that, I read one of Dionne Brand's, I guess, more traditional works of poetry. I mean, not traditional, but in the sense that, like, it's poems, you know, and they're clearly poems. No Language is Neutral. I think it's very fitting that the word language is in the title itself. The depth of language in this collection is incredible. So this one I just gave 5 out of 5. I feel like that this was really a top tier poetry collection. If you like reading poetry, I would recommend No Language is Neutral. If you're a poet yourself and you're very interested in poetic creation and contemplating poetic creation itself, then I would recommend The Blue Clerk. Very meta poetry, you know, where the poetry is about the poetry. I would love to know what you guys have been reading lately. What have you been loving? What have you been hating? I want to know. So that's all for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video. Bye.